We use the term adaptive challenges to describe the second type of gap, the kind we don't yet know how to close, or at best, know only partially how to narrow. We could call these innovative challenges or transformative pressures, and we sometimes will. But for the most part, we use the term adaptive challenge because nature gives us all sorts of insights in our effort to understand the development of new capacity. In nature, the essence of an adaptive challenge is a problem situation or opportunity that demands that the organism build from its old capacity and develop new capacity. In nature, adaptive challenges select for species that have the beginnings of the needed new capacity. And if the species does not create those new adaptations, it risks dying out. By analogy, all of us are constantly responding to the challenges and pressures in our environment with the aim of finding our right adaptation to survive and thrive in our changing and challenging world. In nature, thriving has the bottom line of reproductive success, having many offspring that have many offspring. But thriving for people can mean many things beyond numbers of offspring. People can thrive in their lives with smaller families and without having children. Thriving for us is not only the physical survival of our children, although that is essential to many of us. Beyond reproductive success, we also strive to live in a way that realizes our values. For example, to do meaningful work, raise children who are good human beings, or create a more free and just society. In a sense, we human beings define a host of moral and spiritual values, and therefore we create new kinds of gaps between our aspirations and reality that we then wish to close. We set the values we strive by and reach, and therefore we define the adaptive challenges for ourselves, our families, our organizations, and our societies. Therefore, unlike in all other places in nature, our adaptive challenges are not only produced by changes in the physical and competitive environment around us. Our adaptive challenges also come from within us. Throughout our lifetimes and over the course of generations, we discern from our interactions with each other, from the accumulated wisdom of our ancestors, and from our growing understanding of the texts we hold sacred, the values we should strive to achieve. We run into adaptive challenges when our current capacities don't allow us to successfully make good on the key values and aspirations that we have set for ourselves, forcing us to build new capacities, and sometimes to reassess our values in order to thrive. Making these needed changes is a real challenge, not only because it demands that we go beyond what we currently know how to do, but because it involves so much uncertainty about whether we can succeed and about what we might lose in the process. You know the adage, people resist change? It's not really true. People love change when they know it's a good thing. People aren't stupid. Nobody gives back a winning lottery ticket. What people resist is not change per se, but the losses that sometimes accompany change. When change involves real or potential loss, people hold on to what they have and resist change. Leadership then requires a deep respect for the pains of change. You have to understand what you are asking of people when you ask them to change. Often, the only way to meet an adaptive challenge is to accept losses as part of the change, often in ways that involve tough choices requiring sacrifice. These are the challenges that I believe call for leadership, when there are no easy answers, and when capacity building requires sifting through what to conserve, what to give up, and what innovations will enable us to take the best from our history into the future. I don't believe a persuasive, visionary leader can step in and solve the adaptive challenges people are facing. The difficult work of deciding how to interpret and balance overlapping values, which losses to accept, which ways of doing things to change, which new capacities to build, and how to do so. That's the work that must be done to meet an adaptive challenge. And almost always, this work has to be done by the people who live in the gap between their values and their situations. As much as the people might wish it were so, no leader can be relied upon to answer these questions effectively because the know-how is yet to be developed. And the know-how, when discovered, has to then reside in the hearts and minds and lives of everyday people who are living the solution. If adaptive solutions are situations where the gap between desires and reality can only be closed by people themselves internalizing the change to make the change real for themselves, then we need an idea of leadership that effectively supports this systemic kind of work. Leadership, then, as we will use the term in this course, is this practice of adaptive work, creating with people new capacity to meet the challenges they face to thrive in our changing and challenging world. Of course, you can't effectively mobilize people to work through an adaptive challenge unless you are able to recognize when a challenge is adaptive or has adaptive parts. The success of your leadership depends on your ability to distinguish challenges that are technical, problems that can be solved by authoritative and managerial expertise, from challenges that are adaptive and thus require the building of new capacities. Like in medicine, if you get the diagnosis wrong, you'll get the treatment wrong. In my experience in many diverse contexts, the most common source of failure in leadership is a diagnostic failure. People treat adaptive challenges as if they were technical problems. When people make this mistake, they approach an adaptive challenge in a problem-solving mode, failing to recognize that what they need to provide is the mobilizing and organizing of people to create new capacity to meet the challenge. This mistake can be disastrous. The tendency to apply technical solutions to adaptive challenges is, I think, the primary cause of low implementation rates of even good ideas and potential solutions. For example, when doctors recommend exercise and diet regimens for patients, and patients don't comply. When brilliant public policy analysis performed in universities, think tanks, and government agencies get no traction. When well-considered strategic plans developed by the major strategy consulting firms get placed in a file cabinet. Or when peace is negotiated by a group of expert representatives, but breaks down when the people out in the countryside have to grapple with its meaning in their lives. Though very costly, this diagnostic mistake is easy to make. Challenges don't come with their technical and adaptive components labeled and flagged for us. And often we are under a lot of pressure to provide solutions quickly with a minimum of disruption. So properly diagnosing the situation can be very difficult, even for people who are familiar with this distinction. For people in positions of authority, perhaps the most powerful reason to misdiagnose adaptive challenges comes from the dynamics of the authority position itself. When you attain a position of significant authority, people inevitably expect you to treat adaptive challenges as if they were technical, to provide for them a remedy that will restore normalcy with the least amount of pain and in the shortest amount of time. That puts enormous pressure on people in authority to have the answers rather than raise the tough questions. We see that dilemma even for a doctor having to tell a patient, I can only solve part of the problem by operating, by doing surgery on your heart. You are going to have to solve the other part of the problem by changing your diet, your exercise regime, and by quitting smoking. Doctors are wonderfully trained in being technical experts, but they are very poorly trained in mobilizing people to change their ways. A key difference between adaptive and technical work is that with adaptive problems, you cannot take the problem off of people's shoulders. With adaptive problems, the people themselves are part of the problem, and the solution, therefore, lies in part within them. If they don't change their ways, then you have no solution. All you have is a proposal. But giving work back to people often violates their expectations for answers from authorities. And the more distress, the stronger the yearning for authorities to know the way. And as a consequence, people in authority often feel great responsibility to meet the expectations placed upon them, and realize that if they fail to meet those expectations, they also run the risk of losing their jobs. The second reason people in positions of authority tend to address adaptive challenges with technical solutions is personal. They pride themselves on being able to fix the problems that other people can't solve. It's part of their identity and pride to be competent and capable of taking problems off of other people's shoulders and giving them back solutions. That's what authoritative expertise means. So in the face of an adaptive challenge, it's hard for them to acknowledge that they've come to the edge of their expertise, that they no longer have the capacity to provide answers, and that the best they can do is to frame up the right questions, identify the key realities that need to be addressed, and then challenge people to take responsibility for tackling those problems. We all take pride in knowing rather than not knowing. Being able to step back, to get off the dance floor and onto the balcony, and notice when and how you are being pushed to see a challenge as a technical problem when it may not be, is a crucial skill in providing effective leadership.
So is leadership the ability to recognize that lack of competency or to mobilize the people to go develop that solution?
Yes, now we're in the ballpark.
Okay.
Yes.
There was actually a question. I'm just trying to.
Well, you asked two questions. First, you have to be able to diagnostically, you have to be able to distinguish that part of the problem that is amenable to technical expertise,
Okay.
and that part of the problem that requires new capacity.
Okay.
Most problems come bundled. You know, for example, HIV comes bundled. Part of the problem is amenable to expertise. Now for $200 a year, we can keep people alive for maybe a whole lifetime. I mean, that's a blessing. And it took a lot of investment and a lot of scientific know-how to discover that. But part of the problem remains adaptive. And if we treat the problem as if it were only technical, we're going to neglect critical parts of the problem. We won't really meet the challenge. We'll have a partial solution. So yes, so leadership then begins with a whole diagnostic task of how do we distinguish the parts of the challenge that are technical from the parts that are adaptive? What are the diagnostic indicators? And then how would you begin to break the adaptive challenge component into parts? And then that begins to move us into the domain of action, which was the second part of your question.
Yeah.
How would you then begin to mobilize people to develop that capacity? Which is also beyond your own capacity.
I don't know.
Well, but that's a good place to start, even to be able to say, I don't know. And let me tell you, after you graduate, it's going to be even harder, because you'll graduate with a degree and everybody's going to expect you even more to know.